In the autumn of 1930, the world's attention turned to a nation that had remained uncolonized while nearly all of Africa fell under European domination. In Addis Ababa, amid ancient rituals and modern pageantry, a diminutive man was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, claiming descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. His name was Haile Selassie, and for the next 4 decades, he would become one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century. A symbol of African dignity to some, a divine figure to millions, and to others, an autocrat clinging to medieval power in a revolutionary age. His story is one of extraordinary triumph and tragic fall, of a man who addressed the League of Nations as Mussolini's bombs fell on his people, who became a living god to Rastafarians, and who ultimately died alone in his own palace at the hands of those who had once called him their emperor. This is the story of the last emperor of one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, a story of resistance, contradiction, and the collision between ancient kingdoms and the modern world. To understand Haile Selassie, we must first understand the nation he came to rule. Ethiopia was never merely another African country. While European powers carved up the continent at the Berlin Conference of 1884, dividing territories with rulers and ink across maps that bore little relation to the people who lived there, Ethiopia stood apart. This was a civilization that traced its roots back thousands of years to the kingdom of Aksum, which had traded with Rome and Greece, minted its own currency, and adopted Christianity in the 4th century, long before most of Europe embraced the faith. The Ethiopian Empire, known to its people as Abyssinia, had weathered invasions, internal strife, and the rise and fall of dynasties. Its emperors claimed the title Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, asserting lineage through Menelik I, the legendary son of Solomon and Sheba. Whether historical fact or powerful mythology, this narrative gave Ethiopian monarchy a sacred legitimacy that transcended mere political authority. The emperor was not simply a ruler, but God's anointed representative on earth. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II achieved what no other African nation had accomplished. They decisively defeated a European colonial army. Italy's attempt to colonize Ethiopia ended in humiliating retreat, a victory that resonated across the colonized world as proof that African armies could triumph over European military might. Ethiopia emerged from the scramble for Africa as one of only 2 independent nations on the continent, alongside Liberia. Yet by the early 20th century, this ancient empire faced profound challenges. It remained feudal in structure, with power divided among regional nobles called rases, each commanding their own armies and territories. The vast majority of the population lived in rural poverty, bound to the land through systems of serfdom. Slavery, though officially discouraged, persisted in practice. Modern infrastructure barely existed beyond the capital. If Ethiopia was to maintain its independence in the 20th century, it needed modernization, but modernization without losing its soul. Into this complex world in 1892 was born Tafari Makonnen, the child who would become Haile Selassie. Tafari was born in the town of Ajarsa Goro, the son of Ras Makonnen, a powerful noble and trusted cousin of Emperor Menelik II. Ras Makonnen served as governor of Harar, one of Ethiopia's most important cities, a cosmopolitan center where Arab, Somali, and Ethiopian cultures intermingled. Here, young Tafari received an education unusual for Ethiopian nobility, instruction not only in traditional religious texts and Amharic literature, but also in French, the language of diplomacy. The boy proved exceptionally intelligent and intensely curious about the world beyond Ethiopia's borders. While other young nobles focused on military prowess and feudal politics, Tafari absorbed lessons about modern governance, international relations, and the technologies transforming other nations. His father ensured he understood that Ethiopia's independence, won through blood at Adwa, could only be preserved through engagement with the wider world, not isolation from it. When Ras Makonnen died in 1906, Tafari was only 14, but already he had absorbed a crucial lesson. Ethiopia must modernize to survive. The boy was brought to the imperial court in Addis Ababa, where Emperor Menelik II, now aging and ill, took interest in this bright young relative. Tafari watched the court's intricate politics, learned when to speak and when to remain silent, and began to understand that power in Ethiopia required not just noble birth, but also cunning, patience, and the ability to navigate between tradition and progress. When Menelik II died in 1913 after years of incapacitating illness, Ethiopia entered a period of instability. His grandson, Lij Iyasu, assumed power, but quickly alienated the church and nobility through erratic behavior and suspected sympathies toward Islam in a deeply Christian empire. By 1916, a coalition of nobles, with the church's blessing, deposed Iyasu. They elevated Menelik's daughter Zewditu as empress, but placed Tafari, now 24, as regent and heir apparent. Here began Tafari's true political career. As regent, he possessed authority but not ultimate power. Empress Zewditu was conservative, surrounded by traditional nobles suspicious of change. Tafari had to move carefully, building alliances, demonstrating competence, and gradually introducing reforms without triggering a backlash that could cost him everything. He focused on international recognition, understanding that Ethiopia's sovereignty depended partly on how other nations perceived it. In 1923, he secured Ethiopia's admission to the League of Nations, the first African nation to join this predecessor to the United Nations. It was a diplomatic triumph that announced Ethiopia as a legitimate actor on the world stage, not a colonial possession, but a sovereign state with rights under international law. Tafari also began cautious internal reforms, establishing schools, inviting foreign advisors to help build infrastructure, and attempting to curtail the power of regional nobles. Each step generated resistance from conservatives who viewed modernization as a threat to their privileges and to Ethiopian tradition. Tafari learned to advance his agenda incrementally, claiming each reform served to strengthen, not undermine, Ethiopian sovereignty and Orthodox Christian identity. In 1928, he maneuvered to have himself crowned Negus, or king, a significant elevation in status, while Zewditu remained empress. The balance of power was shifting. Then in April 1930, Empress Zewditu died under circumstances that remained somewhat mysterious, officially from illness following a diabetic crisis, though rumors of poison circulated then and persist now. Whether natural causes or conspiracy, her death cleared the way for Tafari's ascension. On November 2, 1930, Tafari Makonnen was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, taking the regnal name Haile Selassie II, Power of the Trinity. He became the 225th monarch in the Solomonic dynasty, or so the official genealogy claimed. The coronation would be one of the most spectacular ceremonies of the 20th century. The coronation of Haile Selassie was designed to announce Ethiopia's arrival as a modern nation while affirming its ancient traditions. Representatives from nations across the globe attended, envoys from Britain, France, Italy, the United States, Japan, and others. Journalists, photographers, and newsreel cameras captured the event for audiences worldwide. For many Westerners, it was their first real glimpse of Ethiopia. The ceremony blended Christian ritual with imperial tradition. Haile Selassie and his wife, Empress Menen, were anointed with holy oil by the Abuna, the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The emperor donned magnificent robes and received the imperial crown, scepter, and orb. He sat upon the throne of his ancestors, surrounded by the symbols of Ethiopian Christianity, crosses, religious icons, and priests in elaborate vestments chanting ancient hymns. Outside the cathedral, Ethiopian warriors displayed their martial traditions, while military bands played modern anthems. It was precisely the image Haile Selassie wanted to project: an ancient civilization confident in its identity, yet capable of engaging with the modern world on equal terms. The new emperor wasted no time implementing his vision. He promulgated a constitution in 1931, Ethiopia's first, that established a parliament, though with limited powers. Ultimate authority remained with the emperor, but the gesture toward representative government was significant. He continued building schools, hospitals, and roads. He invited foreign experts to help develop agriculture, establish a modern army, and create a functioning bureaucracy. He worked to abolish slavery gradually, knowing that moving too quickly would trigger rebellion from nobles whose economic power depended on unfree labor. But even as Haile Selassie worked to transform his empire, danger gathered beyond Ethiopia's borders. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had consolidated fascist power and dreamed of a new Roman Empire in Africa. Italy had never forgotten its humiliation at Adwa in 1896. Now Mussolini saw an opportunity not just for revenge, but for resources, prestige, and expansion. Ethiopia, despite its League of Nations membership and international recognition, stood in the crosshairs of fascist ambition. Throughout the early 1930s, tensions escalated along Ethiopia's borders with Italian Somaliland and Eritrea, both Italian colonies. Minor incidents were manufactured into provocations. Italian military forces accumulated on the frontiers. Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations, reminding the international community of its obligations under the League Covenant to protect member nations from aggression. The emperor understood the gravity of the situation. Italy was a modern industrial power with aircraft, tanks, artillery, and poison gas. Ethiopia's army, despite Haile Selassie's modernization efforts, remained largely feudal, brave warriors armed primarily with rifles, swords, and shields, commanded by regional nobles whose loyalty to the central government was uncertain. In conventional military terms, Ethiopia could not win a prolonged war against Italy. Haile Selassie's strategy was therefore diplomatic and moral. He would demonstrate to the world that Ethiopia was a civilized nation, subjected to unprovoked aggression, that the principles of the League of Nations meant nothing if a member state could be invaded with impunity. He believed that international law, collective security, and the conscience of the world's democracies would ultimately protect Ethiopia. It was a profound miscalculation, though an understandable one. In October 1935, without declaring war, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Hundreds of thousands of Italian troops, supported by aircraft and modern artillery, poured across the borders. Haile Selassie mobilized his forces, and Ethiopian armies, despite being outgunned and outmatched technologically, fought with fierce determination. The Italians used tactics that shocked the world. They deployed mustard gas, dropping it from aircraft and firing it from artillery in direct violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Poison gas contaminated water supplies, inflicted hideous injuries on soldiers and civilians alike, and turned battles into massacres. Italian forces bombed hospitals marked with Red Cross symbols, machine-gunned refugees, and conducted reprisal killings against civilian populations. Ethiopian resistance was heroic but ultimately futile against such overwhelming force and such ruthless methods. Regional armies won occasional victories, but the broader strategic situation deteriorated steadily. By May 1936, Italian forces approached Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie faced an agonizing choice: remain and be captured or killed, making himself a martyr, but removing any possibility of continuing resistance or flee into exile, preserving the possibility of eventual return and keeping the Ethiopian cause alive on the international stage. He chose exile. On May 2, 1936, Haile Selassie and his family fled Addis Ababa by train toward Djibouti, then by British warship to Jerusalem and eventually to England. 3 days later, Italian forces occupied the capital. Mussolini proclaimed the foundation of Italian East Africa, combining Ethiopia with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, and declared Italy's King Victor Emmanuel III as Emperor of Ethiopia. The Italian occupation would be brutal. Thousands of educated Ethiopians, clergy, nobles, and potential resistance leaders were executed in systematic purges. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church faced persecution. Italian colonial authorities attempted to destroy Ethiopian culture and identity. Though resistance, both armed guerrilla movements and passive non-cooperation, never ceased entirely. Meanwhile, Haile Selassie prepared to address the world. On June 30, 1936, Haile Selassie stood before the League of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. As he began to speak, Italian journalists in the gallery jeered, whistled, and shouted, attempting to drown him out. Security removed them. The emperor continued, and what followed became one of the most prophetic speeches of the 20th century. Speaking in Amharic, his words translated for the assembled delegates, Haile Selassie detailed the atrocities committed against his people, the use of poison gas, the bombing of civilians, the systematic destruction of a nation. But he did not merely recount Ethiopia's suffering. He warned the gathered nations that what had happened to Ethiopia was a test of international order itself. If the League of Nations failed to act, if collective security proved meaningless, then no small nation was safe. Today it is us, he warned. Tomorrow it will be you. I asked the 52 nations who have given the Ethiopian people a promise to help them in their resistance to the aggressor, what are they willing to do for Ethiopia, he asked. And the great powers who have promised the guarantee of collective security to small states on whom weighs the threat that they may one day suffer the fate of Ethiopia, I ask, what measures do you intend to take? He concluded with words that would echo through history. It is us today, it will be you tomorrow. The speech was remarkable for its dignity, its lack of personal bitterness, and its clear-eyed assessment of what Italian aggression meant for international order. But dignity and prophecy did not translate into action. The League of Nations imposed limited sanctions on Italy, but these were inadequate and unenforced. Britain and France, the two powers capable of compelling Italian withdrawal, feared driving Mussolini into alliance with Hitler. They chose appeasement over principle. The League's failure to defend Ethiopia destroyed its credibility. When Hitler later violated the Treaty of Versailles, remilitarized the Rhineland, and began his own program of aggression, the precedent was clear. International law could not stop a determined aggressor. Haile Selassie's warning proved prescient. Within 3 years, Europe descended into the Second World War. During his exile, Haile Selassie lived modestly in Bath, England, at a house called Fairfield. He maintained a small court of Ethiopian exiles, continued to correspond with resistance leaders inside Ethiopia, and worked tirelessly to keep his nation's cause before international audiences. He gave speeches, granted interviews, and published appeals. He became a symbol of resistance against fascism, though the democracies remained reluctant to act on Ethiopia's behalf. Everything changed in 1940. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany in September 1939, Italy remained neutral. But in June 1940, as France collapsed and Britain appeared vulnerable, Mussolini declared war on the Allies, hoping to share in Nazi Germany's expected triumph. Suddenly, Italian East Africa became a strategic target. British forces began operations to liberate Ethiopia, not primarily from humanitarian motives, but because doing so would remove an Italian threat to British interests in East Africa and the Middle East. Nevertheless, for Haile Selassie, British motivations mattered less than the opportunity. In July 1940, he returned to Africa, arriving in Sudan to join British and Commonwealth forces preparing to invade Ethiopia. The emperor did not return merely as a figurehead. He helped recruit and lead the Gideon Force, Ethiopian patriots who had continued guerrilla resistance throughout the occupation. These forces, commanded by British officers including the legendary Orde Wingate, but infused with Ethiopian fighters loyal to Haile Selassie, harassed Italian positions, cut supply lines, and demonstrated that Ethiopian resistance had never been extinguished. The campaign was swift. Italian forces in Ethiopia, isolated from reinforcement and facing combined British-Ethiopian offensives, collapsed. On May 5, 1941, exactly 5 years after fleeing, Haile Selassie entered Addis Ababa in triumph. He had returned, vindicated in his strategy of exile and international appeal, restored to his throne by a combination of British military power and Ethiopian patriotic resistance. If you found yourself drawn into this story, captivated by the rise and fall of empires and the resilience of nations, consider staying with us for more journeys through history. The past has so much to teach us about leadership, resistance, and the forces that shape our world. The emperor's restoration, however, came with complications. British authorities initially attempted to treat Ethiopia as a liberated territory under their administration, rather than as a fully sovereign nation reclaiming its independence. Haile Selassie had to negotiate carefully to reassert Ethiopian sovereignty. He succeeded, signing an agreement in 1942 that recognized Ethiopia's independence, while allowing British military presence during the war. The emperor now faced the monumental task of rebuilding a nation devastated by years of occupation. Infrastructure had been destroyed or neglected. The economy was shattered. Thousands of educated Ethiopians had been killed in Italian purges. Regional nobles, some of whom had collaborated with the Italians, needed to be reintegrated or punished. The emperor himself had been away for 5 years, during which local power structures had shifted. Haile Selassie approached reconstruction with renewed determination to modernize. He understood that Ethiopia's humiliation had stemmed partly from its backwardness, its inability to defend itself with modern military force. He was determined this would never happen again. He would transform Ethiopia into a modern state, even if that transformation had to be imposed from above against resistance from conservative elements. In the post-war era, Haile Selassie increasingly positioned himself as a leader not just of Ethiopia, but of Africa itself. As European empires began their slow, often violent process of decolonization, the emperor offered Ethiopia as an example of African capability for self-governance, dignity, and progress. In 1963, he played a crucial role in establishing the Organization of African Unity, headquartered in Addis Ababa. The OAU was intended to promote solidarity among African nations, coordinate opposition to remaining colonial regimes, and provide a forum for resolving conflicts between African states. For Haile Selassie, the organization represented vindication. Ethiopia, which had stood alone against colonial aggression in 1935, now stood alongside dozens of newly independent nations as they claimed their place in international affairs. The emperor's Pan-African credentials were genuine. He provided diplomatic and sometimes material support to liberation movements fighting against Portuguese colonialism in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, against white minority rule in Rhodesia and South Africa. He offered scholarships for African students to study in Ethiopia. He advocated for African unity and dignity on every international platform available to him. Yet there was profound irony in Haile Selassie's role as champion of African liberation and progress. Within his own empire, he ruled as an autocrat. The Constitution granted Parliament minimal power. Dissent was suppressed. While he had worked to abolish slavery formally, feudal relationships persisted throughout rural Ethiopia. The vast majority of Ethiopians remained desperately poor, illiterate, and bound to land owned by the emperor, the church, or regional nobles. Political power concentrated in the hands of a small elite loyal to the emperor. Haile Selassie genuinely believed in modernization, but his vision was one of modernization directed from above by an enlightened monarch. He built schools but controlled what could be taught. He encouraged economic development, but within a framework that preserved imperial authority. He presented Ethiopia to the world as a progressive African nation, while at home maintaining a system that differed little from medieval feudalism. For a time, this contradiction could be sustained. Ethiopia's prestige from its history of independence, its role in Pan-African politics, and Haile Selassie's personal charisma and diplomatic skill maintained international support. Domestically, the emperor's authority seemed unquestionable, divinely ordained, historically legitimate, and backed by military force. But beneath the surface, pressures were building. By the 1960s, a new generation of Ethiopians had come of age, many of them educated in the very schools and universities Haile Selassie had established. These students, intellectuals, and young military officers looked around their country and saw a jarring gap between the emperor's international rhetoric about progress and the reality of Ethiopian life. They read about socialism, democracy, and revolution. They saw how other African nations, despite inexperience and challenges, were attempting to build more egalitarian societies. They questioned why Ethiopia, with its proud history of independence, should tolerate a feudal system that kept millions in poverty while nobles lived in luxury. Initial protests were small, easily suppressed, but in 1973 a crisis exposed the regime's fragility. A severe drought struck northern Ethiopia, particularly the province of Wollo. Crop failures led to famine. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 people died of starvation. International relief organizations attempted to provide aid, but Ethiopian authorities, embarrassed by the crisis and reluctant to admit its severity, initially hindered relief efforts. As images of starving children reached international media, the gap between the emperor's carefully cultivated image and Ethiopia's reality became undeniable. Perhaps worse, from the regime's perspective, was the contrast between official silence about the famine and the emperor's opulent lifestyle. Reports emerged, true or exaggerated, of the emperor feeding his palace dogs gourmet meat while his subjects starved. Whether literally accurate or not, such stories crystallized growing anger. Students protested, teachers went on strike. Even the military, backbone of the emperor's power, grew restless. Junior officers and enlisted men, many from poor backgrounds, questioned why they should defend a system that allowed such suffering. Underground cells of Marxist-influenced military officers began coordinating, discussing not whether to act, but when and how. Haile Selassie, now in his 80s, seemed increasingly detached. He made some concessions, allowing the prime minister to acknowledge the famine, authorizing some reforms. But these came too late and were too modest. The emperor, who had once navigated treacherous political waters with skill, seemed unable to grasp that the world had changed. The divine right of emperors, the ancient legitimacy of the Solomonic dynasty, these meant nothing to a generation demanding bread, justice, and participation in their own governance. In February 1974, military units mutinied, not violently at first, but through strikes and demonstrations, demanding better pay and conditions. The protests spread. Students, workers, and intellectuals joined. The Coordination Committee of Military Units, calling itself the Derg, Amharic for committee, emerged as the focal point of opposition. The Derg initially claimed loyalty to the emperor while demanding reforms. They arrested ministers, nobles, and officials associated with corruption and repression. They forced the emperor to appoint a new prime minister, but each concession only emboldened the revolutionaries. The Derg's demands escalated. By summer 1974, it became clear they intended not to reform the monarchy, but to abolish it. On September 12, 1974, the Derg formally deposed Haile Selassie. The official announcement was almost casual, read on state radio. The emperor was removed from power, the constitution suspended, the parliament dissolved. 300 years of Solomonic dynasty rule ended not in battle, but in bureaucratic proclamation. Haile Selassie was placed under house arrest in the Grand Palace, the very residence from which he had ruled for decades. The man who had addressed the League of Nations, who had been hailed as a champion of African dignity, who had been worshipped as divine by Rastafarians in Jamaica and beyond, was now a prisoner of his own military. The Derg embarked on radical transformation of Ethiopia. They proclaimed socialism, nationalized land and industry, and began programs to redistribute wealth. They also initiated a Red Terror campaign that would kill tens of thousands of suspected opponents. Ethiopia descended into turmoil, revolutionary purges, regional rebellions, and eventually war with neighboring Somalia. As for Haile Selassie, he lived under house arrest for nearly a year, isolated, his fate uncertain. Different accounts exist of his treatment. Some describe him maintained in reasonable comfort, others suggest deliberate humiliation and neglect. What is certain is that on August 27, 1975, state radio announced that the former emperor had died of complications from a prostate operation. Almost no one believed the official story. The circumstances of Haile Selassie's death remain disputed. The official account of medical complications satisfied few. Alternative versions proliferated, that he was strangled, suffocated with a pillow, or killed by some other deliberate means. The Derg provided no credible evidence, allowed no independent verification, and buried the body secretly, reportedly beneath a toilet in the palace as a final indignity. Only in 1992, after the Derg regime itself had been overthrown, were remains identified as possibly those of Haile Selassie discovered beneath a concrete slab in the palace. In 2000, these remains received a state funeral and were interred in Holy Trinity Cathedral in Addis Ababa, alongside Empress Menen, who had died in 1962. The emperor's death marked the end of an era, but not the end of his story. Haile Selassie remains one of the most controversial figures in African history, viewed dramatically differently depending on perspective and political orientation. To many in the Rastafarian movement, particularly in Jamaica and throughout the Caribbean diaspora, Haile Selassie is divine, the returned Messiah, a Black Christ, the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The Rastafarian faith, which emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s following his coronation, sees his dynasty's claim to Solomonic descent as literal truth and interprets biblical prophecies as referring to him. His exile and return parallel the biblical narrative. His speeches against oppression resonate with Rastafarian emphasis on dignity and resistance to Babylon, the oppressive Western system. That Haile Selassie himself repeatedly stated he was merely a man, not divine, did nothing to diminish his status among true believers. In Ethiopia, perspectives are mixed and often painful. Many older Ethiopians, particularly among the traditional elite, remember the imperial era with nostalgia as a time of international prestige, stability, and gradual progress. They argue Haile Selassie was a modernizer constrained by circumstance, that he genuinely worked to improve his nation within the limitations imposed by its history, regional politics, and conservative resistance. They point to the schools he built, the infrastructure he developed, and Ethiopia's elevated status in African affairs. Others, particularly those who suffered under his regime or who embraced the revolution, view him as an autocratic feudal relic whose vanity and refusal to implement genuine democratic reforms allowed hundreds of thousands to die unnecessarily. They note the concentration of land ownership, the suppression of dissent, the persistence of poverty, and the brutal crushing of regional autonomy movements, particularly in Eritrea. Historians attempting neutral assessment acknowledge both elements. Haile Selassie was genuinely intelligent, politically skilled, and committed to Ethiopian sovereignty and dignity. His speech to the League of Nations displayed moral clarity and strategic foresight. His role in Pan-African politics was constructive. His resistance to Italian invasion, even when doomed militarily, maintained Ethiopian identity and eventual independence. Yet he was also a prisoner of his own ideology, unable to envision Ethiopia without himself at its center, unable to share power genuinely, unable to transform the feudal economic structures that kept his people impoverished. His modernization was always limited, always directed toward strengthening the empire with himself as emperor, never toward empowering Ethiopians to govern themselves. When crisis came, he lacked the flexibility to adapt, and his fall was swift and total. The famine of 1973 revealed the moral bankruptcy of a system where an emperor lived in splendor while subjects starved, and no mechanisms existed for accountability. The Derg's subsequent violence demonstrated that replacing one autocracy with another, even under revolutionary rhetoric, solved nothing. Ethiopia would suffer decades of conflict, dictatorship, and famine after Haile Selassie's death, suggesting the problems were deeper than one man. In the end, Haile Selassie was the last of his kind, the last absolute monarch in Africa, the last emperor of Ethiopia's ancient dynasty. His life spanned an era when such figures could still command international attention and respect, when divine right monarchy had not yet become completely anachronistic. He outlived that era and the world that gave him context. He achieved things worth acknowledging. He kept Ethiopia independent when almost no one else could. He elevated his nation's status on the world stage. He provided inspiration to colonize and oppress people globally, showing that Africans could stand with dignity before European powers. His speech to the League of Nations demonstrated moral courage and political foresight that European leaders lacked. He also perpetuated a system of inequality, concentrated power in his own hands, suppressed democratic aspirations, and ultimately presided over humanitarian catastrophe through rigidity and vanity. He wanted to be remembered as the modernizer who kept Ethiopia independent and dignified. Many remember him as the autocrat who fed steak to his dogs while his people starved. Perhaps both are true. History's greatest figures are rarely simple. They contain contradictions, achieve noble goals through questionable means, or embody both their era's possibilities and its limitations. Haile Selassie was a man of extraordinary intelligence and political skill who genuinely believed in Ethiopian greatness and African dignity. He was also a man so convinced of his own divine appointment that he could not imagine Ethiopia without himself at its center, a blindness that contributed to his fall and his nation's suffering. The story of Haile Selassie matters beyond his personal drama. It illuminates fundamental questions about leadership, power, and change. When does modernization from above become oppression? When does stability become stagnation? When does national dignity maintained through autocracy become less valuable than democratic participation, even if chaotic? When does a leader's past achievements cease to justify present failures? These questions have no simple answers, which is why Haile Selassie's story continues to provoke debate, continues to inspire some and anger others, continues to resist easy categorization. He was the last emperor of Ethiopia, symbol of African resistance, warning voice in the wilderness, an autocratic monarch brought down by his own contradictions. His reign encompassed triumph and tragedy, vision and blindness, dignity and decay. On that August day in 1975, when the former emperor died in his palace prison, an era ended. The ancient Solomonic dynasty, whether mythologically or historically rooted, would produce no more emperors. The man who had been crowned amid such spectacle, who had addressed the League of Nations with such prophecy, who had become a god to millions, died alone, his empire swept away, his body hidden in shame. Yet his voice echoes still. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. The warning about collective security's failure proved tragically accurate. The call for African dignity and sovereignty contributed to a continent's liberation. The example of resistance against fascist aggression inspired others. These elements of his legacy endure, whatever judgment history ultimately renders on the man himself. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable life of Haile Selassie, the last emperor of Ethiopia. His story illuminates an entire era of African history, the collision between ancient traditions and modern forces, and the complex nature of leadership in times of transformation. If you found this exploration valuable, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you have personal or family connections to this history, and subscribe for more deep explorations of the figures and events that shaped our world.